My project was called Dictators and Juans, reconsidering the development of tourism in Greece from the years 1967 to 1974. Um, so the way that I came to this project was uh, through a class called Topics in Greek Film, which I took first semester here at Columbia with Professor Dimitris Antoniou. Um, and throughout the course of that class, we examined a book called Destination Dictatorship, which was looking at the development of tourism under Francoism in Spain from the years, I think from specifically from 1954 to the death of Franco in the early 1970s. Um, and the author, Justin Krumbau, of this book, his argument was going against a major strand of, uh, I guess, the Spanish historical literature, which was saying that tourism had really democratized the country and led to more open lifestyles and, uh, more, I just, I guess, more open markets and whatnot. And there was this kind of logical jump that, well, more open markets equal um, a more democratic country. And he's arguing against this using a variety of sources, most of which were documentaries, newsreels, films, um, some ideological works of major regime figures. Um, and his argument was essentially that the Francoists used tourism to subtly sort of reorganize their control uh, of Spanish society and sort of hide the fascist origins of the regime. So to kind of misdirect people from what had initially gone on in the 30s and 40s, um, while also kind of supporting lifestyles that the regime was itself supporting. And I applied this sort of framework to the Greek case, which was kind of happening contemporaneously, slightly later than Spain, the Greek tourist boom. But it also happened under a right-wing authoritarian regime. Um, and that was kind of my initial question was why why is there a tourism boom when the like sort of founding principles of this regime, on the surface at least, are sort of puritanical, traditionalist, and very, very suspicious of Western influences. So that was my initial question going in, um, it kind of pervaded the thesis as well. But what I ended up looking at more specifically was, well, given the fact that there was a tourism boom and it was supported by the regime, sort of what were the effects of this? Um, so again, I looked at two. My two main sources were two popular comedy films uh, from the early 1970s. Um, and I guess initially going in, I thought I would have. I had these big aspirations. I was going to have like 4 or 5 sections of the paper, and it just ended up not working out because, I don't know, 40 to 50 pages seems like a lot, but then you kind of run out of space. So, um, before I specifically get into the films real quick, um, my kind of what I kind of found from not only films but uh, just secondary sources that I had studied and whatnot was that really the regime was not as well defined, for example, as the Francoist regime, which was specifically fascist. In the beginning, there was a sort of concrete ideology that you could point to. With the Greek regime, that never specifically existed. There was always competing interests and between the top regime officials and other factions and other supporters like the church, which was a major player in Greek politics at the time. So there was never a specific. It wasn't a total contradiction to say that there was a tourism boom and that the regime was supporting it. It was kind of like the thing that made sense. Like this was going to get people from abroad to support the regime, well, not necessarily to support the regime, but to come to Greece and spend their money and make it seem as if everything was normal. And then within Greece, amongst the Greek people themselves, there was never a huge support for the regime. but there was a narrative, an economic narrative that was peddled that was like, oh, Greece is modernizing. We're coming from the depths of like all this crappiness, and people can live like consumerized lives, and that was a narrative that tourism sort of profoundly fits, because it's so imagistic. It's so you see people just like hanging on beaches and whatnot, and living a lifestyle that's very different from what people in Greece were accustomed to in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which had been very difficult times. And so that is how I specifically came to these two films, which starred a guy named Christodoulatos, who was like one of the most famous Greek actors ever, but also at that time a huge star, a comedy star. And these films, my argument was that these films are performing ideological sort of work for the regime, that they're not necessarily sanctioned by the regime or even produced by someone that is an overt pro-regime supporter. So in a very subtle way, they're showing a version of Greece that's not really how things necessarily are. They're showing a version of Greece that is bright and sunny, and there's just these average people that end up going to these extraordinary locations in Greece, islands and whatnot, spending their time with like millionaires and attracting all kinds of women and whatnot. And at the same time, in real life, the islands of Greece are sort of both pleasure peripheries and at the same time places where people are being tortured for being regime dissidents or being exiled, and living these like really terrible existences. And of course, those things never appear in these films. So you get a very specific picture of Greece, which I think is very powerful, given that was when sort of television and film were becoming, mainstays in Greek homes. And it's not as if the Greek people had, access to media outside. It's not the way things are now. So they're seeing constantly these specific images and learning to understand Greece in a very certain way. So that was kind of the first class, I guess, that I took that was really, that really focused on film as like a way to understand certain historical moments, or as a specific supplement, I guess, to certain issues and whatnot. And I found it really interesting because like I said, I kind of came to the project by happenstance. So, like, when I first enrolled in the program, even though, like, I'm Greek, both my parents are Greek, I fluently speak Greek, I never really studied Greek history. It had never interested me in that way specifically. Like, going in, I guess what I kind of wanted to look at was, I don't know, certain facets of the Cold War, like, because my undergraduate theses were kind of in that time period, 50s, 60s, but more like based on Soviet Union and whatnot. So I'd kind of initially been thinking about that, but then I don't know, like I enrolled in this class and was like, oh, this is pretty cool. I don't know, something that was just totally random that I would have never thought of, and that ended up being my thesis.